Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. I decided to do a part 2 to my Fellgor video a couple of weeks ago, and I've decided to paint the next two Chaos variants in the team. Those are the Tzeench representative and the Nurgle representative, which are called the Fluxspray and the Toxhorn. In the last video I painted the Herdgoad and the Mangler, and there's Slaanesh and Khorne representatives in my kill team, so do check out that video if you're interested in seeing how I painted those. One key thing that you need to know from the last video is I used 3 core brown paints for the default scheme, so I include a little bit of these paints in every mix I make for the skin. I decided to start with the Fluxspray, who represents Tzeench, so I decided to put blues and the browns on my wet palette to get started. I would start by mixing my darkest blue with my darkest brown to get a mix that would be my dark base coat shadow colour. And I did add a tiny bit of my slightly brighter blue, which is Abyssal Blue, and that's because I want that to be my core colour. When I had a mix that was dark and I was happy with it, it had just enough blue that I was looking for, I applied it to the model as a base coat, all over the skin. With the initial base coat finished, I decided to mix up my next layer. For this, I'd use my slightly brighter brown for my middle brown, and I'd use my Abyssal Blue mainly here. I did add a tiny bit of the dark brown and the dark blue to this mix just to ensure that the colours were unified. By having a larger percentage in the mix of the brighter blue and the brighter brown, it would just guarantee that this colour was a little bit brighter than the darker base coat before. So then I applied it to the model, just in highlights all over the skin, covering about, 90% of the base coat that I'd done before. I was really just leaving the very darkest recess lines between the muscles of the previous base coat layer. And I focused all of this layer on the upward sides, so really the bottom sort of 10% that I wasn't painting was always along the bottom of the muscles, as if the light from the top was coming and shining down and the very bottom was in the darkest shadow. This was helping me to practice paint my volumes, which I've heard a lot of miniature painters on the internet say is a really important thing to practice, and I think I'm kind of getting the hang of it with these skins on these Fellgors. Here's a quick look at the blue paints I was using: Aegis Aqua and Abyssal Blue from Armypainter, and then Imperial Blue from Vallejo. For my next mix, I predominantly used Aegis Aqua and my lighter brown, and then I added that together, but then also did make sure, once again, to add a little bit of the previous colours in as well to unify things up. Once again, making sure that I have a lot more of my brighter colours in this mix so that I get a bit of a brighter blue. I'm looking to get a tiny bit more saturation as well as a tiny bit more brightness. And then once again, applied this to the model, this time covering only about 70% of the previous base coat. It's really interesting how I judge the levels of this, but it's just something you kind of pick up over time. The more muscles you practice on, the more you'll get the idea of the volumes and how the light can look good if you apply it into certain sort of ratios over each area. And with this layer, you can start to see that the muscles are starting to pop out now. For this part, I just wanted to show that I did slightly enhance my mix to be more blue. You can see there's a bit of a grenishy highlight there, and then I changed it to be a little bit more blue, which was on the lower half of that bit you could see. And so now I've redone the whole miniature with the more bluish highlight, and that's what it looks like. And it's a good tip not to be afraid to change your mixes as you go and just redo parts when you need to. Then I began to make up my next layer of highlight, and I used an even greater ratio of the lighter blue and the lighter brown in this one. Adding a tiny dot of my darkest blue into this mix does just help bring some blue saturation into it to ensure that it still feels really blue and I'm not moving into a light grey area. And then it was time to add that layer, and once again adding that to a smaller area than the previous layers. I think rather than describing this one as a percentage, let's just say I was trying to leave about 1 millimeter or 2 of the previous layer showing, maybe probably just 1 millimeter, but it's a very tiny amount, but you leave a little bit showing and then it feels like a more gradual transition. If I was going to put a percentage on it, it would be 60% of the previous layer. And here's the look at the miniature as it is. You can see a bit of the definition on the muscles is really good now. There's contrast and very dark shadow lines, But I still haven't gone as bright as I could go, so I'm going to mix up one final mix and one layer of highlight that is even brighter and a little bit more blue. So we're going for mainly just Aegis Aqua in this mix with a tiny bit of brown and only the tiniest dot from the previous colours. When I was happy that the mix was sufficiently bright enough, I decided to start applying it mainly to the face at first because I wanted to make sure that that had a really nice bright pop to it. And then around the rest of the model, along the top edges of each of the muscles, really just a small amount of each, which you can see as I do the final spin because this is the skin finished on this guy. So now we're going to move on to the Toxhorn. So here he is, this is the Toxhorn and he's going to represent Nurgle. So I'm going to paint him with a lot of green because Nurgle is all decay and horrible stuff. So we're going to go with some really nice vibrant greens, but we're going to mix them with our brown, so it's going to desaturate them and turn them into nasty, gooey greens that we're going to paint all over this model. So we start with a nice dark green. I mixed my darkest green from Vallejo with the dark brown from before, and I got this mix that looks like this. I applied it all over the skin as my base coat. Then it's back to the wet palette to make a second layer, and I used my slightly brighter brown, my middle brown, with a slightly brighter green and some of the darkest green in the mix so that I could create a slightly brighter green. To ensure that there was a really pallid and sickly looking nature to this skin, I wanted to make sure I added a bit of a really desaturated pale colour. I used green grey and I added this as a little bit of the skin to ensure that it was desaturated and pale. This would be my main base coat for this model, so again this was about a 90% coverage, just leaving the dark green in only the recessed lines between each muscle. The thinner the line, the neater it looks in a way, so you want to try and ensure that you've got nice thin lines like you can see on the side there. When I finished the whole skin it looked like this. And it was time to go back to the wet palette to mix up another highlight layer. This one needs to be more green, more bright, just like all the rest. You get the gist by now, but making sure there's a little bit of green grey in there, just for that pallid, sickly paleness. And for this layer, I would just be covering about 60% of the previous layer. And once again, I focused on all the top parts of the volumes, leaving more of the previous layer on the bottom parts of each of them. Also, I don't think I mentioned what the greens I'm using were, and they were Angel Green, Scorpy Green, and Bile Green from Vallejo Game Colour. And with that done, we were left with skin that looked like this. And now I think I mixed up one final highlight layer just for the tops of the muscles. I think I compared the two models together, and when I looked at the Flux Spray with his blue, I just thought there was a bit more contrast, a bit more of a pop. So I thought I have to do that on the Nurgle one as well. So I came in with an even brighter green. I won't show you how I mixed that because you get the idea by now. But it was much brighter, had more of the lighter greens in it, and much more of the green grey. And then I added that all over the very tops of the muscles, just as a thin line for the most part. This is what it looked like when it was done. This is the back of the model and this is the front. You can see there's good definition to those muscles now. So now it's time to paint the details, and the details will be painted much the same as the previous video because I want all of these to look like they're members of the same kill team. So I used charred brown to cover all of the leather parts. Then I used Skavenblight Dinge to highlight the clumps of fur. And I covered all of the metallic areas in Vallejo's metal colour gunmetal grey. Because it's designed for an airbrush, it's thin and can be applied quickly and easily, and that makes it a really good option when you're trying to speed paint. With all the metal colours, things started to look like this, and then I started to highlight all of those metals with Model Air Silver from Vallejo. It's great, I love it, and it's extremely shiny, so I like to use it for that really quick and easy burst of shine that gives your metals a lot of interest quickly. With all the metals highlighted, this is what the miniature was looking like at this stage. And I wanted to briefly show and mention that I was doing all of the exact same steps on the Flux Spray, making sure he had highlighted weapons and all of his leather parts were covered, and picking out all of his fur with the Skavenblight Dinge. To highlight all the areas I'd previously painted charred brown, I used leather brown from Armypainter. It gave me a desaturated highlight rather than an orange-brown highlight. And I made sure just to apply this neatly, but one thing I did do over all the leather parts was just add some tiny scratches and little bits of texture just to give some visual interest, especially on bits like this gun holster where it's a large, big, flat surface. For the material around the waist, I used black, and then I covered that with some charcoal, and then I covered that with sombre grey. And that blueness in the grey helps this stand out from the Skaven Blight dinge in the fur. And then it was time to work on some details across the miniatures, so I did the horns on the Tox horn, and I just added some green grey into my mix of my charred brown that I'd used for the base coat, and I used 2 layers of that highlight with increasing amounts of green grey in it until I got a bright horn at the top. And I used some of the lessons from painting my Spirit Longma and the antlers that I did on that to help me with painting that horn. Then I covered the little skull symbols on all of the toxic canisters and the toxic smoke cloud itself in Scorpy Green from Vallejo. And then I used the extremely bright and saturated Bile Green from Vallejo in order to create a highlight on this toxic smoke cloud. Because this guy represents decay, I wanted to make sure he had a super rusty weapon, and the weapon is sculpted to look like it's rusty, so this goes with the vibe. And I added my usual rust mixture that I've used on previous videos in my war bases and in part 1, where I use dark brown. So in this case, I was reusing paints on my palette already, so I was using dark flesh tone and grunge brown, which are 2 of the brown paints I've been using in the skin, just to create 2 layers of rust. I wanted to give the flux spray magic looking eyes, so I used magic blue from Vallejo and then a dot of Aegis Aqua at the top. Other than his third arm, I struggled to find something that was a defining feature, and I didn't want to paint the arm a completely different colour. So for this guy, I decided to try and add some inks to the weapons to give it some magical glowing effects, so I used purple and blue for that. And then I quickly cleaned up his waste material a bit. Then it was time for bases, and if you saw part 1, then you know how I paint these bases, but if you didn't, then I covered these in a layer of charcoal, and then I used sombre grey to highlight them. It's a quicker version of a previous short I did where I painted void bases in a bit more detail, but basically it gives me a really quick and easy recipe to paint these bases fast. A key part of this for visual interest was also adding little scratchy details of texture all over the bases, which you'll see me do in a minute. With all the scratchy details and texture all added with random touches of the brush to the surface of the base, I then added my rust, which is the same recipe as I described before, using dark flesh tone and grunge brown from Vallejo to add 2 different layers, so you've got brighter rust and darker rust. It makes the rust look more aged and old and natural. I then worked on a few other tiny details like the metallic grate on the base that I covered in a few scratchy metal colours, including a little bit of bronze and some silver, and then I went around the models, just checked, tidied up anything that looked a little bit unneat, and then it was time to do the reveal. So let's start with the flux spray. I was initially quite worried that the blue would be too far from the brown to make a really nice and interesting tone that looked similar to the other members of the kill team, but I think it's worked out, and I think when you see him in a minute next to the others, it actually looks really cool. I think the little splash of colour on the weapons really helps bring those out, and now I think we should look at the Tox one. Some of the final details on this guy included the little pus spots that he's got on his arm, as well as a little bit more rust over his shoulders and a few other little bits here or there, including the metals on the grate as well that you can now see. And I really love this guy so much that I think he's a joint first with me with the Mangala in terms of how much I like him. This guy maybe takes the edge just because he's got a few more interesting details like that smoke cloud. And then I wanted to show the 2 of the models together so you can see both of them and what they look like. And then I did also want to do one final clip for this video where I show all 4 of the Fellgors together, all my Chaos variants in one place, so that you can see how good they all look. And for a speed painting effort, not super fast because I can't paint super fast, but for fast for me at least, these are really cool and I think they turned out really good considering. If you're still here, thanks so much for watching and I hope you have a good week and I'll be back for another video next time.